Peace, 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 peace. How y'all feel out there? I should have had them do a break before I came out here after Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. Make some noise for Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. But it is great to be with all of you today. As many of you know, I have an organization called the Mental Wealth Alliance. It's committed to improving access to mental health resources in black communities and increasing awareness and destigmatizing mental health and mental health treatment. One of our biggest goals is to help this country decriminalize mental illness and replace incarceration with healthcare resources and opportunities for people in our communities. So I'm excited to build with people who have personal and professional experience and knowledge of these issues. My first guest is a really good friend of mine. His name is Shaka Senghor. That's right. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Letters to the Sons of Society, and the author of Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison System. Make some noise for Shaka Senghor, y'all. My good brother, how you feel today, man?
I'm blessed. Man, Dr. Dyson just brought that heat.
I know, right?
So I'm in good energy.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about your experiences, with mental issues in the criminal justice system, because it's deeply personal for you. Tell people what happened.
Yeah, so I grew up in Detroit, and when I think about mental health, I think about the stories that we're not telling, the conversations we're not having, specifically around black men. And it's one of the reasons I started to write, because when I went to prison, there was only that kind of press clip of why I went to prison. It wasn't the story leading up. And so I just want to tell a little bit about the journey, and not to excuse the behavior, but to help explain why we have this rampant gun violence in our community. So first of all, the first act of violence that I've ever experienced was in my own household. And when I ran away from that household when I was 14 years old, my best friend got killed. So the first time I experienced murder was at 14 years old. There was nobody to come and say, hey, this shouldn't have happened, or even explain why it happened. And then for the next few years, every year, there was a shooting or a death within my community or my family. In total, in my family, 8 of us have been shot. When I was 17 years old, I got shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. And when I went to the hospital, they literally just processed me through. And the doctor, I will never forget this moment of him extracting the bullet from my leg so callously, and me sitting in that hospital bed, and my dad and my mom coming in, and at that point I was the third of their children who had been shot. And there was no offer of therapy, there was no mental health options. And when I went back to the neighborhood, the only people I could talk to was other guys who had got shot like I got shot. And all of us reacted to that reality the same way. We started to carry guns. But more importantly, I began to create this narrative in my head. And what that narrative said was that if I find myself in a conflict again, I will actually shoot first. 16 months later, I shot and tragically caused a man's death and was subsequently sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. I ended up serving a total of 19 years, and 7 of those years was in solitary confinement.
So when did you first become aware that you actually were suffering from something called PTSD?
I was really fortunate to meet some of the most incredible mentors that I've ever met in my life. And I have tons of incredible mentors out here in the world in multiple industries, but these were men who were serving life sentences. And I remember them saying to me that, if you take care of your mind, you'll be able to add value to your community when you're released. I couldn't even see 20 years down the line. But these brothers, they just stayed on me. They kept giving me books, and they was, feeding my mind and challenging the way that I thought. So they were my first therapists, because they had recognized the things that they had gone through. And then once we were able to put a name to it, I began to lead a class in the prison called Houses of Healing. And categorically, every person who walked into that class had adverse childhood experiences, early childhood trauma, high levels of gun violence, and it went consistently across, leading down the path to them committing acts of violence.
Wow. Now, you provided help, but when did you, ever ask for help at the time?
So when I was in prison, you don't get mental health as a treatment. You get it as a diagnostic, so that they can label you as, I remember they told me I was antisocial. because when the woman asked me what happened, I gave her the very matter-of-fact, process of what led to me going to prison. And she was like, well, you don't have any remorse. I'm like, you didn't ask me how I feel, you asked me what happened. And so it wasn't until the end of my sentence, where it's a mandatory class we had to take called assault of offender psychotherapy. And even in that class, it was more about understanding how we were criminal in our orientation, not how our minds was positioned to survive in an environment with high levels of gun violence. So once I got home, I started to realize that I was still dealing with the symptoms of solitary confinement. And it was watching Khalif Browder, who many may know from being in Rikers Island and him committing suicide once he was released, that I was like, I actually need to, I'm functioning at a very high level, but I see all these triggers. Like, you don't do that type of time in solitary confinement and come out the same way. It really tears you down. It is designed to destroy you. And I was fortunate to just start reaching out to mental health professionals. And sadly and unfortunately, what ends up happening is most of them are so surprised that I'm actually here that I end up being their therapist. And so it's really hard for people getting out of prison.
So what should we be doing as a country to address like the unmet mental health needs that you've experienced and that we continue to witness?
I think one of the most important things is we have to really talk to young people in our community. We have to be honest in our conversations. We don't really talk to young boys, specifically young boys, when you're thinking about gun violence and you're thinking about who is impacted the most by incarceration. We exceed those numbers by any stretch of the imagination. So one, it has to start very early on. We have to start sharing that mental health isn't because something is wrong with you, that it's important as just a practical way of taking care of your overall being. We have to have more of these type of convenings where people who actually come from the culture, come from the community, is making mental health a cool option as opposed to making it something that's problematic. And my ask, especially as we're talking about criminal justice, the most urgent thing for me personally, as someone who's experienced it, is to bring an end to the abuse of solitary confinement. What is happening in that environment is unconscionable. And I can promise you, I have been in that environment where I've seen people with severe mental health issues, bipolar, schizophrenia, have that criminalized and further incarcerated because the system isn't set up to deal with that. And then what happens is that people go straight from solitary confinement back to community. When I transitioned home, I had dealt with all the horrific realities of prison. And not once did they say, when you get out, you should actually seek mental health. I had to discover that on my own. And I'm really fortunate in the sense that I'm literate. I'm very resourceful, but that's not the case for a lot of people walking out of prison. So my big call to action is let's bring an end to the abuse of solitary confinement. No human being should be locked down for 23 hours a day at all.
Word.
And I'll say this last thing. We would never allow our pets to be treated the way that we allow our fellow human beings. Like, we would never allow that. You can't lock little Fluffy up for 3 days for 23 hours without PETA being at your door. So I think we have to raise the way that we think about our fellow humans, and we have to destigmatize the experiences that young men and women are going through in our community.
That's right. Make some noise for Shaka Senghor, y'all. Delivering quality mental health care begins at the community level. And we have two people who understand how mental health problems are being criminalized. Psychologist Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble is an internationally recognized author. She's the founder of the Coma Project and the chief mental wealth officer of the Mental Wealth Alliance. I can't even do what I do without her. And Paul Samuels is director and president of the Legal Action Center, a not-for-profit public interest law firm that works to replace incarceration with healthcare and treatment. So make some noise for Dr. Alfiee Noble and Paul Samuels.
You were fabulous. Thank you. Fabulous.
Dr. Alfiee, Dr. Noble, describe the need for mental health care within our communities.
Oh, Lord. So that's a huge thing. Part of how we're trying to address that is you with the Mental Wealth Alliance, you and me together, and with the Coma Project for our young people. The needs are really around something we talk about a lot that I don't think everybody fully understands, and that's cultural competence, right? Cultural competence is not providers who know every single solitary thing about every single solitary group, because that's not possible. Cultural competence is, are you willing and able to receive the person who's coming to you for help in the moment? Can you sit with their story? As my brother, Mr. Senghor, said, when you ask me to recite what happened to me, you're not asking me about the emotion. So when I do that, take it for what you asked for. Don't criminalize it. Don't pathologize it. And so I think that's a need. Another need is we need more mental health professionals, which is what you're doing with the Mental Wealth Alliance. How do we get young people into and through these systems? Now, I'm going to keep it real. These toxic academic systems, right? It's not about a leaky pipeline. It's a greasy pipeline, and they pushing people out, right? So that people cannot finish. I was talking to a sister earlier, and she was saying 10 of them started the PhD program together. Now it's 8 left. That's by design, right? So when you're of color in these systems, or you have a marginalized identity, it is a challenge. Your very being is questioned every time you show up. That's part of the reason I call myself a recovering academic, because I couldn't do it no more. Academia was toxic, right? And so I need to be able to be this fully realized black woman, as you say, black queen. I'm just gonna claim that, I'm gonna own it. And I need to be able to show up and say things like African American, Latino, Latinx, Latine, Native American, Asian American, our Arab young people, they need unique kinds of support, and that's lacking. So those are a couple things. I think the other thing is also what you're doing. We need to be able to talk about our stories without feeling pathologized, right? We need to be able to articulate that when we have these experiences with racism and discrimination, and homophobia, and transphobia, and gender discrimination, and Islamophobia, that can't be pathologized, right? If I've had these experiences and going into new experiences, I'm worried about people treating me in these ways because why? It's happened in the past? That's not paranoia, that's reality. And so somebody should be patting me on the back for being realistic and preparing myself for what I might engage in and experience. So for me, those are some of the things that we really need to address the lack of mental health resources within our communities. And for us as people of color, I'm looking at the beauty out here. This is beautiful. Right? Looking at all of y'all. I see my reflection. I see my mirrors out here. We need to be able to do that every day for our young people and for the not so young people. We need to be able to feel loved and valued and supported and seen. Those are some of the things I would say.
Ooh. You mentioned young people and, the lack of mental health resources, within our communities create obstacles for young people who need, mental health treatment. Can you describe the kinds of services that are most needed for the young people?
Yes. So again, it's coming back to this issue of culturally competent services. It's coming back to this issue of readily available services. It's coming back to this issue of services that are outside the standard kinds of treatment. 50 minutes, sitting in the office, one-on-one, ain't nobody got time, right? And so the parents don't have time to take off of work to get kids there during work hours when they have to work and the kids are supposed to be in school, right? So we need different kinds of models. The other thing I think we need is everybody is not into the concept. I'm gonna say this, I know I'm a psychologist, y'all don't kill me. Everybody's not into the concept of traditional talk psychotherapy. So there have to be other alternatives that people can use, right? Like some people need nudges. They just need somebody to say, keep going, you're doing all right. Some people just need to be able to sit with someone and have an experience where they feel seen, heard, and valued. We always talk about that with the Mental Wealth Alliance and with the COMA. What does that look like? Maybe you get a group of young people together and you have them express themselves through art. That can be therapeutic, right? I'm a hip-hop head, I'm old school, I'm Gen X. So maybe you have young people who write, maybe they write a rap, and that's the way they express themselves. We just need to give our young people opportunities to heal in different ways than we're traditionally taught to heal. The other thing I think our young people need is they need approaches to care, and psychotherapy, talk therapy in particular, that really speak to their experiences. So people will talk about things like cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy and EMDR and all these things. The thing that drives me nuts, and which is why I went into research and became a researcher and then left academia and started my nonprofit and working with you on yours, is we have to have researchers out here who are infusing our cultures and our experiences into the types of therapy that they generate so that people feel like they're recognized and seen and valued while they're sitting and getting CBT. It's not just CBT. And stop giving me these I'm gonna adapt it a little bit, put some Spanish shit in. I'm gonna adapt it a little bit, put some Indian in it, right? No, I need a whole new system of CBT that really is from the ground up, speaking to who I am. And I think when we fail to bring those things to our young people, you know, young people gonna keep it real, right? So if you're not giving them what they need, back in the day, they would just like throw you away. Now they're gonna put you on blast, right? And I don't wanna get put on blast, so I'm gonna do everything I can to try to give these young people a reflection of who they are. So those are some of the things I think our young people need, and I think that's what they're asking for from us. And the final thing I'll say is, they want us to stop and listen. They want us to stop talking at them and just listen to them. Some of my young people are here, the hidden healers, and stuff. This is what I've learned from them. So those are some of the things I would say.
Absolutely. Paul, does mental illness increase the likelihood of interactions with the police, and are people with mental illness more likely victims of crime?
Yes, I mean, there's such a huge misunderstanding about all of this. We could despair very easily, given the public policy situation, the legal situation, because really our healthcare system, and I mean, we don't call it criminal justice system anymore because there's not justice that permeates that system. So whatever, you know, we refer to it as the criminal legal system, or very often, too often, the criminal punishment system, because we should be dealing with people who have health problems with health responses. And instead, what are we doing? Especially for black and brown people, we have a default system that is the criminal punishment system. I mean, you know, I think that the most devastating way to illustrate that is to say, ask you, what are the 3 largest mental health providers in the United States? And the answer is Rikers Island, the New York jail system, and the jail systems in Los Angeles and Chicago. And if we just pause to think about that for a second, those are the largest programs. We certainly know they're not the best, and we certainly know they're not the right places for people to go. It'd be very easy to despair. We're in the midst of among the worst epidemics of both suicide prevention and drug overdose that we've ever had in this country. And just, you know, to tell you another shocking fact, that for people who are incarcerated, who then leave when they go back to their communities, they are 40 times more likely to die of a drug overdose in the first 2 weeks than the average American. So we are failing, but let's not despair. Instead, let's think about and reflect on the accomplishments we have and the success we have made, but even much more important, what we still need to do. Yes, I mean, we blame people with mental health for mass shootings when in fact that's not the case. And as you said, Charlamagne, people with mental health issues are much more likely to be victims of crimes than other people are. So what do we need to do? We need to build up our healthcare system, make it, you know, as Dr. Alfiee said, to make it warm and friendly, but also make it big enough and good enough so that Shaka's story doesn't keep happening all over the country all the time.
You know, Paul, I'm not going to lie, Paul, you gave out a lot of bad news just now, but you and your organization have found solutions, the Legal Action Center. What are some of those solutions?
Yes, so, you know, I like to start off with the despair because then it gets better. There are really things that we can do. Incarceration doesn't work. I mean, we have all seen that these policies, and unfortunately a lot of it started right here in New York in 1973 with the passage of the Rockefeller drug laws, which labeled people who had drug problems, especially black, brown, and indigenous people, as criminals rather than people with health issues. And that really is what launched mass incarceration. But many of us advocates here in New York, we toiled, and it took almost 40 years to completely do it, but the drug laws were finally reformed. And laws have been changed in New York and elsewhere now to try to open up opportunities for healthcare. But what we really need to be doing is making health responses the first response. People shouldn't be arrested at all in many cases. If they have a drug problem, if they have a mental health issue, they should be dealt with by health professionals. Fortunately, there has been progress also at the federal level. The passage of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act and the Affordable Care Act created really most of the tools we need to change what is happening, to build up our healthcare system. The next thing that has to happen, though, is that we need those systems to be adequately funded. They need to be providing quality services, and they need, as I keep repeating, to be the first response. And arrest should not be the first response.
That's right. Make some noise for Paul Samuels and Queen Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble. I want to bring in our next guest. She needs no introduction. Letitia Tish James is the 67th Attorney General for the state of New York. As the state's top law enforcement official, she is using her office to support the decriminalization of mental health. Please welcome Attorney General Tish James, y'all. That's right. Give it up, give it up, give it up, give it up. Now,
where's Brooklyn at?
damn, Brooklyn used to really make noise. Is that gentrified now when you say
Maybe it's
Brooklyn
not
at?
on. Where's Brooklyn at?
Ah.
They're over there.
Now, as public advocate for New York City and now AG for New York State, you've seen how untreated mental illness feeds into the criminal justice system. Can you describe how your understanding of this issue has developed over the years?
So mental illness is not an equal opportunity problem. And unfortunately, individuals who are primarily black and brown, African American and Latino are met with force and not compassion. And the reality is that mental illness should not be a crime and poverty should not be a crime. And what we are seeing is the trans-institutionalization of individuals who are struggling with mental illness. What do you mean by that, Tish? I mean the following. We have closed facilities in upstate New York which were primarily focused on treating individuals with mental illness. And unfortunately, government was supposed to open a bunch of community-based organizations to address their issues, and they have not. And so what do we see? We've witnessed individuals on the streets and in our criminal justice system. All you have to do is visit Rikers Island, as I have visited, and you will see throes and throes of individuals who are struggling with mental illness. And so we've got to deal with disparity. We have to deal with access. We have to deal with the fact that the police should not be in a position to deal with individuals who are struggling with mental illness. They cannot respond to the needs of individuals who are struggling with mental illness. We need alternatives. Instead of calling 911, we need a dedicated number, and we have a dedicated number. But that dedicated number, unfortunately, is not up and operational at this point in time. So we also need a number of laws that need to be funded. Individuals who don't look like us can get private care, but most people who look like me and who look like you, unfortunately, cannot get private care. Our care is often in the form of a jail or often in the form of a juvenile facility, and that really should not be the case. And so what we need to do as a community, as a people who care about one another and who want to transform, who fundamentally and radically want to transform the system, is we've got to urge government and we've got to elect individuals into office who understand the problem, who recognize that mental illness runs through our community. It's part of my family, I'm sure it's part of yours. And what we've got to do is address it head on and not be embarrassed by it. And we also need to push back on this narrative that the vast majority of individuals who are struggling with mental illness are violent. They are not. Only 3 to 5% of individuals often are involved in violent episodes. Unfortunately, they get the front page news, primarily in the New York Post. And we've got to push back on that narrative because you see them on our streets. Rikers Island should not be a mental health facility and should not be a housing facility. And Rikers Island, as far as I am concerned, needs to be closed.
Why do you think law enforcement has failed to actively, disconnect untreated mental illness and engagement with the police?
They're not trained. They're not trained. They're poorly trained. We need professionals. And what individuals who are struggling with mental illness need is time and space and family. Listen, as the Attorney General of the state of New York, one of the worst jobs that I am tasked with is responding to police officers who unfortunately shoot individuals. I have to investigate those cases. And in instances where individuals are in the throes of mental illness, police officers oftentimes don't know how to deal with it. There are so many instances where I've got to deal with situations where individuals in the throes of mental illness oftentimes use weapons or charge at the police. And their response is to shoot them. And what we need is another response. We need a sensitive response, a compassionate response. We also need to see what other devices are available to restrain individuals who are struggling with mental illness. We need to give them space. We need to give time. We need to stand back. We need to alert their loved ones and family members. We need to talk to them calmly and quietly. That's what we need to do. A gun is not the answer. A gun is certainly not the answer. It should be the last response, and unfortunately, it's the first response.
That's right. So, with all that said, how do you convince police and law enforcement to change?
They're not the answer. I'm not looking to the police. They've got enough problems to deal with. I am looking to other behavioral individuals in the behavioral space, in the behavioral mental health space, who can respond to individuals in the throes of mental illness. If you want to pair police with professionals, okay. But they cannot be the first responders when it comes to individuals in the throes of mental illness, because their only response is either a weapon, arrest them, and we've got a lack of beds, of mental health beds. During the COVID period, they took mental health beds offline to deal with the COVID crisis. My office is holding a hearing all throughout the state of New York, and I am hearing from citizens and residents and individuals who are struggling with mental illness who say, I went to the emergency room and that was the only care that I received. I went to a hospital and unfortunately they don't have the beds. They certainly don't have pediatric beds. I experienced it myself when my girlfriend's child was engaged in self-mutilation, and it took the Attorney General to get her a bed, and that should not be the case. And so we've not replaced those beds, and we've not replaced those hospitals, and we've not replaced those institutions. And so you will see them on the streets, and people will complain, and they'll call 911, and the response is they'll go to Rikers Island, they'll deal force with them, they'll use force to respond to their issues as opposed to love and compassion and understanding, and a behavioral mental health professional.
I know a couple weeks ago, 988 was passed, right? What exactly is 988 as an alternative to 911?
It's a dedicated line. It's similar to 911. But unfortunately, I called it this morning. And I called it, and what you will hear is if you are interested in addressing suicide, we can respond to your issues. And so obviously it needs to be more operational. We need to make sure that it's specific. We need to make sure that they refer them to organizations. But most importantly, we need to invest in community-based organizations and hospital, get more beds online, and address the law, which unfortunately treats mental health, drug addiction differently from any other health care issue. And I know Congress passed that law, but unfortunately, it lacks funding.
Dr. Alfiee, you want to add to the 988?
Yeah, you saw me throw that mic up. I was like, that wasn't for me. That was for the Attorney General. So I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. So 988 also has a text function, and so there's texting that you can do as well. So that's the only other thing I would add. It is functional, but like you said, it really needs a lot more investment, and I'm just going to put the plug in. We also have to make sure that the people who are on the other side are culturally competent as well. We need all of that.
All right. Okay, we got some audience questions. It's a two-part question. I think this is this for Shaka? It's for Shaka. I'd love to hear what resources, tools, and practices to use today to overcome mental health challenges like meditation, journaling, things of that nature.
So thank you to whoever the audience member was, but that's exactly what I do, actually. I started journaling while I was in solitary confinement, and I started with this kind of essential question of how did I end up here? I was an honor roll scholarship student with dreams of being a doctor, and I was reading, Plato's Socrates' Apology, and it talked about the unexamined life, and I began to journal. And through that journaling process, I was able to reassign responsibility to those who had harmed me. I was able to accept responsibility for the harm that I had caused, and it's a practice I continue to this day. I'm always writing out how I think, how I feel. When I got out of prison, I didn't know the many ways that I had been impacted by incarceration. And one of the things that really alerted me was I got into a conflict with my oldest son, who actually has some mental health challenges. And he threatened me, and I was extremely triggered. And I responded out of, old behaviors in terms of how I thought about it. But what I was fortunate to be able to do was actually to call people who can kind of talk me off the ledge. And it was then that I was like, I got to deepen the journaling. I have to meditate. But I really practice mindfulness. And what that looks like is whenever I'm dealing with any adversity, it's bringing myself back to the presence. Anytime that I'm processing things that are very complicated and complex that I don't even expect people who have never been through what I've been through to understand, I have to bring myself to like the moment and make sure that I'm fully in the moment as opposed to the narrative that's playing out in my head. So those practices have served me well. They're not easy. I'm fortunate to have great colleagues in this work who are also system-packed. We got Sam Lewis in the audience, and Lewis Reed, and Topeka Sam, I'm sure, somewhere there. People who have been through it, right? We've been doing this work for a long time. We was doing this work before it became really popular, but we leaned on each other. And in those moments when we're going through stuff that, you can't expect somebody who's never been in prison to understand how triggering it can be when somebody just comes up and put their hands on your shoulder. Or when you're asked to come to a space and it's extremely crowded and you feel your anxiety go up and you have to walk out and people are like, oh, why you leave? Why you leave the club so early? It's like, nah, bro, I had to leave, otherwise I might have shanked somebody in this joint. You know what I'm saying? But having friends and people who are informed on it, and this is why this work is so important. I'm happy that you all have me here, because it's great to have people who've never been through it tell us what it is like, but it's also important to have people who've been through it speak on these platforms.
That's right. Look, we only got like 2 minutes and some change left. So I want everybody to leave with some final thoughts, some calls to action, some solutions. Paul, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, as the Attorney General said, I think as we've all said, resources drive the world. Follow the money. So the money needs to move toward healthcare responses. Big shout out to the Attorney General for being one of the leaders in New York to make sure that money coming from opioid settlements will be going to care. But it shouldn't have to, yes, definitely. But it shouldn't have to be that way. All of the healthcare funding that we have in insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, it should be like every other illness, that those responses are funded by the healthcare streams of funding that we have in place already.
Dr. Alfiee.
I'm just going to say what I always say. I want everybody in here to hear me say and to know and to walk out of here with this idea that you are valuable because you exist. I think that part of our struggle is we don't feel that moment to moment, and when we don't feel that moment to moment, as our brother Mr. Senghor said, we act out in ways that are not the healthiest. So I want you all to hear me say, and I want you to take it in. The only thing I want to share with you as you leave here is you are valuable just because you exist.
Attorney General.
Mental illness is not an equal opportunity problem. 2, mental illness is a spectrum, and so you can't speak to it as just one problem. There are a number of issues as it relates to mental illness. People sometimes suffer from depression, and there are some individuals with chronic mental illness. So you can't treat it all the same. 2, the disparities in treatment, the disparities in care, disparities in funding. We need access to care. We need to make sure that community-based organizations are funded. We also need to make sure that we have culturally sensitive professionals deal with the issue, and criminal justice should not be the response to mental illness, and police and force should not be the response to mental illness. It should be compassion. And last but not least, you guys better vote all across this nation because there's too much at stake. Too much at stake. Every individual, all of you must get to social media and tell people to vote, vote, vote. And let me just say, and I'm gonna say it, it's a political issue, vote Democratic, because Republicans, unfortunately, are just out of touch with mainstream America. There's too much at stake. Stand up for women and reproductive rights, and stand up for communities of color. Thank you so much.
Republicans are white supremacists and fascists. I'm gonna just say it, 'cause I don't think she can, but thank you.
Thank you,
God, have a
Shar.
great day.
Thank you, Shar.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.